It struck me as I was preparing to record this that if you're not looking at the date stamp on these videos, you'll be able to work out what order they come in from the length of my hair and beard, given that right now the barbers are all closed and the beard, well, it's just kind of keeping the hair company. So this video marks the beginning of Holy Week as we hear about Jesus' Palm Sunday entry into Jerusalem. The reading comes from the first 11 verses of the Gospel of St. Mark, chapter 11, and it goes like this. When they were approaching Jerusalem, at Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you'll find there tied a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' just say this, 'The Lord needs it, and will send it back here immediately.'" They went away and found a colt tied near a door outside in the street. As they were untying it, some of the bystanders said to them, "What are you doing, untying the colt?" They told them what Jesus had said, and they allowed them to take it. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they'd cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." Then he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. There's no doubt that this time spent in isolation because of the coronavirus is a deeply distressing time for all of us. We're largely stuck in our homes, and some of us feel very alone. Yes, there's the comfort of telephone conversations, of video links, and of others trying to keep tabs on us, or indeed of us trying to look out for others. But this is hard. For some of us, we find we're being driven to all kinds of self-examination that the normal busyness of life allows us to escape. In some ways, it almost feels as if the universe has turned on us as a species. Some are saying that this is a crisis of our own making because of the ways in which we exploited the resources of the earth God gave into our care. I'll leave others to comment about that for the time being. But for me, there feels like there is something deeply elemental about this. The friendly world has turned on us. And some of us, maybe for the first time, we're realizing that we are not as much in control of the natural world as we once thought we were. We believed ourselves to be in charge, but now that folly is being exposed, and it leaves us feeling vulnerable. These are the feelings into which I'm going to speak over the next few days as we enter Holy Week, and this story from Palm Sunday comes as a reminder to us of who is truly Lord of the elements. And that's why I've made a departure from the normal 3-year cycle of reading. For those who are kind of more interested in these technical matters, we're in Year A at the moment, which means we should be reading Matthew's account of the triumphant entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. But instead I've chosen Mark's account. And I've done that deliberately because Mark's account, probably written before the other gospel writers, has something deeply elemental about it. And that's what makes it so helpful for us in opening Holy Week in this time of what's really international fear and for some weeping. But before we get to that, let's open up the context a little so that we can see what's taking place. In the story immediately preceding this, Jesus and the disciples had been in Jericho, so Mark wants us to understand that this was the journey that they made to get to Jerusalem. Jericho is one of the longest inhabited cities in the world. There's evidence going back for 11,000 years of continuous human habitation. It's a lush city with a tropical climate because it's also one of the lowest cities in the world. It's some 800 feet below sea level. King Herod had his winter palace there because it remained warm in the coldest season. Jerusalem, however, is much higher up. Essentially, it's in the mountains. Those of us who've been there in early spring can testify to just how cold it can get. To get to the top of the Mount of Olives overlooking the city, and from where Jesus and his group walked down into the city, they would have been something like 3,000 feet above sea level. Now, some of us have climbed the tourist path up Ben Nevis in Scotland, which is 4,400 feet above sea level. It's not actually a difficult climb, but it is a relentless one. So while Jerusalem is a little lower than that, the climb from Jericho up to the top of the Mount of Olives is pretty similar. The difference is in the distance and the climate. It's a hot and dusty climb over a road that's something like 15 miles long. This would have been a very tiring route. So pity the two poor disciples that then Jesus sends on ahead of them. They've just been climbing in the heat of the wilderness, and now Jesus asks them to go a little faster to get ahead and go and find for him the colt that had never been ridden. Ah, the colt. This is the key to the whole story for us, and the reason why I chose Mark's telling of the story. The colt's got two meanings, one of which would have been plain to first century Jews, and one which is more plain for us. So for those surrounding Jesus, they would have picked up his actions as being a reference to the prophet Zechariah, which in chapter 9, verses 9 and 10, it reads like this: "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim, and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off. And he shall command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth." It's a description of the arrival of a king who comes on a humble donkey rather than on a warrior's charger. This is a king who comes in peace, but is nevertheless a king. That's what his followers believed about Jesus. That's why they acted in this way. That would have been the meaning to them. But I believe there's a second meaning for us today in this time of isolation, of nature seeming to turn on us in a way that few of us in the West have ever experienced in our domesticated lives. Look again at what Jesus is riding: an unridden colt. Now Zechariah and the other gospel writers suggest it's a donkey or a donkey's colt, but Mark says no such thing. It's simply a colt. Think about that for a moment. Unridden, untrained, untested. Now, I've ridden and fallen off horses that were well trained and yet still did their own thing. I've watched as a German friend sat in the saddle of a horse that decided it wanted to trot down the street rather than walk with the rest of us, and so off it went with its hapless rider, never having been on horseback before, disappearing into the distance, saying, "Stop, horse! Stop, horse! Stop, stop!" They're not like cars. Horses have a mind of their own. They can be trained, yet even then, they still do whatever they want to if the fancy takes them. But Jesus isn't on a trained horse. Jesus asks for an untrained colt that's never been ridden, and that's what he chooses as his means of transport. There are numerous times throughout the New Testament when Jesus interacts with the natural world in such a way as to show himself to be Lord of all creation, or King of the elements, to use another tradition. But it just so happens that this one fits into our Holy Week scheme. And here, once again, Jesus interacts with something undomesticated, and they forge a partnership. In this time, when the natural world seems to be turning on us, Jesus' mode of transport comes as a reminder to us of his wildness of spirit, his untamed nature, his divinity that refuses to be packaged up and domesticated. In this time of self-isolation, many of us are being forced to face up to truths about ourselves, which we've kept hidden for years, or which have never been tested by circumstances such as these. Maybe we're finding that beneath the domestic lives we've lived, there's a wildness which, though long hidden, still remains. Maybe it erupts as a flaring temper, or settles on the heart like a cold blanket of null emotions. Maybe it's a scream that we have to work hard to keep down, or an energy to run and run, but no place to go, or legs that are just not going to work. What this passage teaches us is that Jesus inhabits the wild spaces. Jesus is not afraid of the wildness within each of us. Jesus engages with an untamed animal without any sense of fear as to what it might do. Now, whenever you hear a hymn or a contemporary song with the word Hosanna in it, what comes to mind? Usually it's got this kind of triumphalist sound to it. There's normally some sense of our God is great and everyone's going to bow down to him. Thing is, that isn't what Hosanna means. It's a cry of help. It's a prayer that literally translates, save now. That's what ties this whole scheme together, what makes Palm Sunday so important. We've seen that Jesus is Lord of the elements, that he can take an unridden animal and ride it. That which is truly wild is his to command. And that is why in the midst of the pandemic in which we find ourselves, we can pray, Hosanna, save us. When we look inside at the parts of ourselves we've managed to ignore for so many years, but which now we're being forced to confront, we can say, Hosanna, save us. And when we look outside, we can look at the paramedics, the nurses, the ambulance drivers, the doctors, and we can see them as the very hands of God. And we can pray, Hosanna, save us now. He is the King of the elements. And that's the theme we'll be taking up over the next few videos for Holy Week, as we see Jesus through the eyes of air, earth, fire and water, and then see how the Spirit comes into play when he's crucified on Good Friday. O God of the wild places, you're not afraid of the elements, of our elemental nature, barely controlled. Be with us in this unexpected place, and inhabit that which scares us, so that we know that you are here too. Amen.